You can see the force goes more into my lead side automatically. In this video, I'm gonna break down and simplify the 4 steps to help you improve your weight shift, and should it even be called a weight shift? Oh, and I'm also gonna explain why I'm standing on a pitcher's mound. If this is the first video of mine you are seeing, I want to welcome you. My name is TJ Valentine. I am a 25-year PGA teaching professional. If you want to know a little bit more about me, I have a bio in the description, but I want to be your guide, your coach, someone to help you along your journey to better golf. I'm not saying I have all the answers. Little secret, nobody has all the answers, but I certainly want to take my experiences, my stories, and everything that I've learned over the past 25 years and maybe help you out a little bit on this journey. So please consider subscribing if you're into this type of content, golf instruction, and a little bit more as we continue to grow here. I do have a question though, and I'm going to start a question of the day. What is your current handicap, or what is your current average score? I want you to comment below, but also I want you to put what your goal is for the next year. So if you revisited this video in 1 year from right now when you're watching it, what do you want your handicap or your average score to be? And if you do comment, I will respond to you with a little bit of inspiration to help you get a little bit better. Now let's get to work. Before we get into that 4-step process to help you strike the ball more consistently, let's define what weight shift is, and should we even be thinking about this as a weight shift by definition? By definition, the weight shift is simply the movement of mass from the trail side to the lead side during the golf swing. We need to have the mass on the lead side at impact in order to control our low point, in order to control our arc depth, and ultimately control our strike. But have you heard the term pressure shift before? So what pressure shift is, it is the force that's being applied to the ground, and you can see the pressure mat right here. The force that's being applied to the ground, not where the mass is, but where the force is applied to the ground. And what I have found over the years, when I talk in terms of pressure shift and I coach pressure shift instead of weight shift, we get much, much better results. So the 4-step process that I'm going to talk about today is going to be all about getting your pressure shift better, which ultimately is going to answer that question, how do I get my weight shift better? So let's go get to work. Just to quickly further simplify and explain what I just said, I'm going to pop the pressure mat reading up on the screen over here. When I ask somebody to produce a weight shift, they are physically trying to move their weight from the trail side to the lead side during the swing. And ultimately what can happen is their center of mass can move too far this way, which means they're going to have to move a significant amount in this direction as they swing back to the golf ball. Now, when I change the thought a little bit and ask them to create a better pressure shift from the trail foot to the lead foot, I get a lot more of this. A very simplified motion relative to how their body is moving in space and time. So again, going forward, we're going to talk about this in terms of a pressure shift and not a weight shift. I use the term weight shift because that's what a lot of people know and understand. Pressure shift out of the gate, a lot of people don't understand. My job is to educate people as a coach, and I want people to understand, number one, the terms, but understand ultimately how you can get better faster. And the more knowledge you have, the better you're gonna be overall. So again, pressure is the force down into the ground, and out of the ground. Weight shift is the center of mass moving from right side to left side, trail side to lead side. So let's talk about step 1. The first thing that everybody needs to have, no matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about a pressure shift, whether we're talking about compression, whatever we're talking about, You need to have a good setup to start. If you have a poor setup to start, and I've said this before in other videos, you're gonna compensate somewhere down the line for that poor setup, and you're not gonna produce a good pressure shift. You're not gonna be able to get into a position where your center is on the left side of that ball, the pressure's on the left side of the ball. You won't be able to consistently compress the golf ball. Till the day I stop teaching, I am going to stress that everybody works on their setup every day if you can at home. It takes 1 minute, 2 minutes, just to stand there in the living room while you're watching the game, while you're watching TV, while you're watching this, and get into a good setup and practice your balance address position. So I encourage you, work on this at home. You need a good setup. You need a good setup for a good pressure shift, but you need a good setup for everything else you're gonna do going forward in this sport. So in terms of a good setup, what I'm referring to here is good posture. We're not bending from the upper back. We're bending from the hip sockets. We have our knees in slight flexion. We have our arms hanging from our shoulders. We're not reaching. We're not too close. But ultimately what we want to have, as you can see up on the screen, we don't want to be on our toes. We don't want to be on our heels. We want to be very balanced toe to heel at address. So if you don't have access to a pressure mat to see where you are in space and time with your balance and with your setup, just take a pool noodle, cut it in half, just like this. Place it on the ground and simply stand on it. And what you're trying to do here is you're trying to find the balance point. You're trying to find if you're too much on your toes, you'll feel it. If you're too much on your heels, you'll feel it. You want to find that balance point. The pool noodles are also squishy enough where if you want to add a little bit of pressure to the lead side, you can feel the pressure into the ground because you can feel yourself squishing that pool noodle just a little bit. Great exercise, gives you great feedback, and it is something I'd love to see you do every day at home. Now, this is where we can play around with this a little bit. In terms of our right foot, left foot, or trail foot and lead foot balance, we can be 50-50, but we also can have a little bit of pressure on our lead foot to start. Now, if you notice on the screen, there is a green dot in between my feet right now. That represents where my center of pressure is down here. Not necessarily my center of mass. They're close, but they're not the same. It's the center of pressure. Ultimately, when we get to impact, we want that center of pressure, that green dot, to be left of the golf ball. That is a good representation of where this club wants to bottom out. It's not the end all, but it's where we need our pressure to be in order to achieve good compression, good low point control, and hopefully overall good arc depth and good strike. So it's okay to start with a little bit of pressure on the front side. I don't mind 55, 60% on that lead side, but we want at least 50-50 to slightly forward. We don't want ourselves to be on that trail side at address unless you're hitting some sort of a specialty shot. I encourage you, work on this stuff at home. If you don't have a pressure mat available, which I know a lot of you don't, there are some simple insole options out there that does measure pressure that you can buy and you can use at home. I'll put a little link below in the description if you want to check those out. But it is important to know where you are in space and time. You've heard me say this before. What you can measure, you can get better. If you don't know where you are, it's tough to make adjustments. I mean, I can tell you for certain, over and over again, when I work with especially new students where I have to establish baselines, I'll ask them where they think their pressure is and they'll give me one answer. I'll get them on the pressure mat, get them on some force plates. They're not in the spot where they think they are. So it's always good to get measured for all of this stuff. Find a coach that has force plates or a pressure mat, or go out and buy those pressure insoles just to see where you are. What you can measure, you can get better. Now go do this at home right now. Let's move on to number 2. So now that we've established a good setup, let's move on to step 2 in this 4-step process to a better pressure shift. And that is the first move off of the golf ball. And I once heard Arnold Palmer say, the first 3 feet of the golf swing is the most important, and I'm not gonna argue with the king. So after I've established that good setup, we have to move the club and create a pivot at the same time. We cannot let the club get too deep before we create a pivot. And here's the reason why. We have weight in our arms. We have weight in the club. Even though the club is not moving fast off the golf ball, there is momentum, there is force, there is weight that potentially is going to drag us in this direction. So if I move my hands, arms, and club off of the golf ball in this direction, and I don't create a pivot, I could potentially get sucked in this direction, and I see it all the time. It's all about the sequence of events. I did a full video on this topic a couple weeks ago. I'll put a link below. After you're done watching this video, go over there and watch that. I did some experiments, I showed you the data. It's pretty wild, so I want to make sure you go and check that out. In order to have a proper sequence, as the club is going back, we have to create our pivot. So as the club is working back, we are already creating a pivot. So this is going to do a couple things. Number one, it's going to prevent us from swaying and moving this way too much before we create a rotation. It's also going to start to establish the pressure into the lead side. So let's say we start 50-50. If I take the club back and create a pivot at the same time, my pressure starts to work into that lead side nice and early. And that's what we want. We want this pelvis to recenter sooner than most people do. So I'll show you on the pressure mat what that looks like. So if I was to take the club back and not pivot early enough, I get dragged. And you can see where my weight comes off of my lead foot and it's significantly into my trail foot. What this is also gonna do is, it's gonna take your trail hip, and your trail hip is gonna get on the outside of your foot. Your knee is gonna get on the outside of your foot, ultimately putting a lot of pressure on this side of your foot, making it virtually impossible to get back in time. Let me go get that pitcher's mound and let me show you something. All right, so fun fact about me, baseball was my first love. I grew up playing the sport fairly successfully, played in college, played a little after. I'm 48 years old, I still play competitive baseball. I coach baseball. I love it just as much as I love golf. So you'll hear me give a lot of baseball analogies because these rotational sports are very similar, believe it or not, from a mechanical standpoint. So you'll hear me bring these things up from time to time. So don't be surprised if the pitcher's mound or other things come out here and there. So make sure you subscribe to see all the fun stuff. So pretend I'm a pitcher right now. And I am standing on the back side of the rubber. I'm a righty, I'm going this way. If I'm on the back side of that rubber, as soon as I get into my windup, what happens? Everything starts to pitch this way. Why? Because my foot is at an angle. So the force of everything is gonna go this way, making it really hard for me to fall in this direction. So we have to stand on this side. Look at what it does to my foot. It pitches my foot in just a little bit on the rubber, keeping my knee on this side of the center of my foot, keeping my hip in a position where I'm not gonna get this way as I wind up, and I can fall towards the plate. Now, how does this relate back to the golf swing? If I get too far outside over here, I'm gonna have to push myself over here. You know what happens when you push? It takes time. And this goes for even if you're in a good position here. If you're pushing off of your trail side to get to that lead side, you don't have enough time to do that. The golf swing, once you get to the top of the swing, on average it takes 0.3 seconds from the time you're here to the time you're here. And when you push, that takes time, because when you push, you're pushing energy down, you're pushing force down, and then it takes time for the force to come out of the ground. So that leads us into, after we have a good takeaway and a good pivot, the next thing we have to do is have a good transition, and it's what I call the fall. So now that we've established you need a good setup, step one, a good takeaway and pivot combination off of the golf ball, step two, step three is our transition. So step three is, like I said, what I call the fall. And let me explain the fall. And this is where my focus on the pressure shift is so important relative to, by definition, the weight shift in moving the mass. So as that club is going back and you're creating that pivot, you need to feel like you're falling into that lead side before the club ever gets to the top. And the reason why this has to happen early is, it goes back to, you have very little time to do all of this. And one of the things that I do see a lot of players do is, takeaway may be okay, but they stay on the right side. They don't fall into the lead side, and ultimately, what are they doing? They're chasing this now. They have no time to deliver the club efficiently, effectively, and consistently. And ultimately, what does the midsection do? It dives forward, creates a whole bunch of other issues in the golf swing. And a lot of issues go back to setup, first move off of the golf ball, and understanding how to move the pressure in the golf swing. So I have a great exercise for the fall and the transition part. Go back to that half moon pool noodle that you already made. Place it underneath your lead foot. So what you can feel immediately is the squishiness of the pool noodle. You can almost imagine that this is a sponge, and you could do it with a sponge if you wanted to make a mess, filled with water. And the objective is, as you go back, good takeaway, good pivot, that fall is going to squeeze the water out of that sponge. That's going to ensure that you're feeling the pressure going down into that lead foot and not laterally. Because when I move laterally, I actually have a very different sensation. I'm not applying that same force down. Great exercise to do at home. You don't need anything fancy. You don't need to buy anything expensive. Get yourself a nice little half moon pool noodle and you got yourself a great golf swing. So we need to have that pressure falling into that lead side before we ever actually get to the top of the golf swing. And it looks something like this. Good balanced setup, takeaway pivot, and I'm falling into that lead side before I ever get to the top. Now I say before I ever, I mean we're talking a tiny difference, but the difference is there. The difference is there. So you have to have that fall. Now, once you get to that position at the top, you are almost done. You're there. You're ready to explode out of the ground at that point. Create a little bit more power as well, but more importantly, keep that green dot, that center of pressure, to the left of the golf ball, which will allow you to compress the ball, give you a chance to compress the ball better than you ever have. So we have step one, setup. We have step two, takeaway. We have step three, the transition or the fall. What's step four? Let's find out. And if you do like this style of video, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe. So let's get into the fourth and final piece of my four-step process to a better pressure shift and all that good stuff that comes along with it. So once you've established a good position at the top where that pressure is into that lead side, that fourth and final step is we have to get out of that pressure. We've established force in here, we've established some flexion into that lead side. We have to now get out of that. And that leads us to number 4, which is extension and rotation. Rotation is a byproduct of extension. The reason why a lot of people struggle with rotation, and I did a video on that as well if you want to check that out, is the fact that they don't get into a position where they can create extension. You know, a lot of people that slide cannot create rotation because of where their body is in space and time. So these 3 previous steps, a good setup, good takeaway and pivot, fall, leads us into a point where we can now create extension and ultimately better rotation than you probably ever have. So simply put, what extension is getting the force that we have applied when we fell into that lead side out of the ground. So once we get to that point, we need to work up as we rotate. So we're working up as we rotate. You're gonna feel the pressure go in and then out, and the chest is going to turn. This is actually a really good exercise to work on it, where you take your lead hand, put it into your knee. So you don't need a club in your hand. You get to the top of your swing, you feel the fall, your lead arm and your lead hand is gonna get to your knee. Then you're gonna slide your hand up as you turn through. So it's gonna look something like that right there. That's gonna help you establish the feeling of extension. And one thing I always talk about in my videos, I always try to give you things to do at home. And all these little drills that I've kind of thrown in today are all things that you can do at home to work on this stuff. I promise you, your sequence is gonna get better. You're gonna start striking the ball better than you ever have. Comment below and let me know how it's going. I'll talk to you soon.